Name is Tom Thompson. My grandfather is Hugh Rimmer, who was commander of the Albacore when it was lost.
So, how many years after his loss were you born?
I was born in 65.
Okay.
So 21 years.
21 years?
And my mom was 3 when the boat was lost.
Okay.
So that was the connection. My mom passed in 2019, so unfortunately didn't get to participate in this, but it is what it is. Glad I could bring my kids to it.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up always knowing he was a commander of a submarine, but it was kind of this distant thing or whatever, you want to call it. And it was kind of like as time has gone on. And then I forgot when they did the memorial in Beaverton, Oregon, was the first time it really came back up again. Jim Converse was great in communicating with everybody. And then this is phenomenal that they actually found the wreckage, and everybody can gather together and memorialize this.
How did that news come to you or to your family? What was it like?
Good question. Emotional, definitely, that they actually found it. But because Jim Converse had communicated to me when the National Geographic had the show Drain the Oceans, and so I started watching all those, loved those shows, really got into them, and Jim was the one who just said it's only a matter of time before they find everything. So that's where the kept it going, and then when he said they actually found it, is amazing.
How do you feel your mother would have responded to that news?
Oh, the same way. Very happy. It was interesting, but I don't even know what she would think. I know she would just be, joy, and phenomenal that it was found. But, she was young. How much she really knew her father is hard to say at this point. But Hugh had 2 brothers who served in the war also. Harmon, who was Army intelligence officer, and Jimmy, who was naval aviator, Air Force aviator. So, family committed, and I did know Harmon and Jimmy very well growing up and until they passed. Great, great family, military family. So. I was Army, not Navy, so, but still, this is just great. It's awesome.
Did your family ever talk of him, share stories, or was it one of those things that was just an unspoken conversation topic?
I guess it was more unspoken. The family history was there. I still have Hughes' sword from Annapolis, so it's hanging on the wall, but there wasn't a lot of discussion about it. Even my great uncle Harmon, who was Army intelligence, he just never really talked about what he ever did. I think that was part of that generation, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was. But it was. I've shared it with my kids, and to make sure they know their great-grandfather's history, and this is great that they can come and witness this.
Any other stories either about him that you know of, or just about the experience of coming to commemorate his loss?
The one story I recall my mom telling that she heard from her mom, which is my grandmother, is when Hugh was in Annapolis, he had crossed the Hudson River when it was frozen over. He and one of his friends had crossed the river to go see their girlfriends at the time, then later his wife, my grandmother. And while they were across the river, the icebreaker came up the river. They couldn't get back across the river, so they had to go however many miles down the river to find the bridge to cross the river. They were late for getting back, and so they got busted. But yes, that was definitely a funny story.
Yeah.
Hugh was, I think when he first got to Annapolis, he was a football player, and then he was injured, and then he worked with the mascot, the goat and the donkey. I always heard a lot of stories about the goat and the donkey. So, but I know this year, so I'm from Massachusetts. This year, the Army-Navy game is in Gillette Stadium, which is in Foxborough, Massachusetts. So plan to get tickets and go see that. When I lived in California, I also saw the Army-Navy game in the Rose Bowl one year. So still go do that tradition whenever I can get to it and watch the Army-Navy game, if not in person, on TV. So yeah, still like all the history. It's great, and this is something to add to it.
My name is Linda Wilber. Nelson Kelly would have been my uncle,
Okay.
and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia. Did you travel from Atlanta to be here today?
Yes,
Excellent.
yeah,
So this was obviously very meaningful for you.
very, yes. It really was. It was more meaningful when they read his name and everything. It really sort of brought home the fact that I had an uncle that was part of World War II, and then when I heard that the ship had so many warships that they had been able to get rid of or destroy,
Yep.
it made me very proud.
And
My name is Scott Wilber. Nelson Kelly Jr. would have been my great uncle. I think, yeah, my great uncle. And growing up, I always saw pictures anytime I went and visited my grandmother of him, but she never really talked about him. Anytime I asked, she kind of tensed up a little bit and be like, oh, well, that was my brother, but he died in the war. And that was kind of all there was. And so when I got the call about this, it was so out of left field that at first, to be honest, I thought it was some kind of scam. And but as I talked further and everything, I realized that no, that this was really happening, that you guys had really found the sub and that we finally have some closure. And I think that's the best part of the whole thing, is that we finally at least know what happened. So it was very meaningful.
And I would ask the same for you about, do you feel a sense of closure, or do you empathize with how this news would have carried for your mother? Or I'm sorry, was it your mother's brother? Okay.
I guess a part of both. I'm like, I wish my mother could have seen this, but I also then have some closure for her, and I feel like I'm representing her and my grandmother, his mother, and so I feel like, yes, there is closure.
Well, my full name is Richard John Gilkison, and the John stands for my Uncle John, who was on the Albacore and who died. He was one of the officers on the Albacore. So he died in 1944 when the Albacore went down, and I was born 11 months later in 1945. And so my dad, his only brother, named me middle name after his brother that went down on the Albacore.
What was the lasting effect on your family? Do you recall your family ever talking about him after the fact?
My grandmother, my Uncle Jack's, everyone called him Jack, his mother, my grandmother, was devastated. I mean, he was her favorite of the two sons by far. I mean, she loved my dad dearly, but she really loved Jack. Mm-hmm. He was firstborn, and he was very special to her. And so we grew up knowing that my grandmother's son and my dad's brother had died. It was not hidden at all. It was all out in the open. We all knew about it. And he had been a magician, among other things. And when I was a young child, I went in one of the cabinets in my house that I grew up in, and there was a magic box there. And I asked my dad, I said, "What's this?" And he said, "Oh, that's your Uncle Jack's magic box. He used to do a lot of magic tricks." And so that was really how I got to know something about my uncle, really, for the first time that was the least bit intimate.
How do you feel the discovery of Albacore? How would that have impacted your mother or your grandmother?
My grandmother.
Your grandmother.
I think for her, probably back then she was, I'm only guessing, but I'm guessing she was in a state of disbelief that he had actually gone down. And I suspect that she hoped for a long while that, somehow he had survived. And so I would think for a long time she had no real closure. And so had she been alive now, when they have positively identified the sub finally, I think it would have given her a sense of closure that would have ended years of stressful hoping and praying that it didn't happen.
What effect did it have on you or other family members that you know of when it was found positively identified?
I let my brothers and sisters know as soon as I found out, and we all shared that sense of again, the only word really is closure, that finally we no longer have to talk about the sub went down somewhere off Japan. We knew, in a sense, although the Navy doesn't release the exact location, but we knew in a sense at least that it had been found, and clearly our uncle had gone down with it. Now, the fascinating thing was 15 years ago or so, I get a call out of the blue. I'm living in Beaverton, Oregon, and they said, we've decided we're going to do the memorial for the Albacore in Beaverton, Oregon. And I said, really? That's where I live? And they said, well, I said, where's the memorial going to be? And they told me it's going to be in a park on basically the same road that I lived on. Turned out the memorial is built, and that's what the pictures are of, 1.5 miles from where I was living in Beaverton, Oregon at the time. And they had a ceremony at that time, and a couple of guys who had actually been on the sub, who were still alive, were at that dedication, and I got to talk to them. They knew my uncle firsthand, and I had nothing but great things to say about him, not surprisingly. And so I often tell that story, and I often start it with the words, well, you're not going to believe this story, but there are no coincidences.
Yeah.
So that's my story.
What impact do you feel, so this was, again, your uncle?
My uncle, yeah.
Your uncle.
My dad's only brother, my grandmother's 2 sons.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, when he died, my father decided to go in the Army. And my grandmother almost, by her account, she almost lost it at that point, because he didn't have to go in the service because his brother had died. And when he decided to go in the Army, my grandmother was just...
Only 2 sons,
really,
or?
Two sons. She was very torn when he decided to serve. And fortunately, he made it through the war okay.
My name is William Hughes, and I'm here to commemorate my uncle Donald Patrick Hughes, who was one of the crewmen aboard the Albacore.
When were you born in relation to his death? Was it many years afterwards, or?
So the sinking of the Albacore, as you know, was 7 November 1944. Mm-hmm. I was born in 1950. My older brother has the same name, Donald Patrick, so he was named after my uncle, and he passed a couple of years ago, and his remains are in the South China Sea, and Uncle Donald is in the Sea of Japan with his other crewmen, or sailors.
What effect did his loss have on your family? Was it something, I found that some family members say, well, it was something that was not discussed, it was just too painful, and others, it would come up in conversation. Was he ever talked about?
Yes, he was, but not, it's kind of odd, because my grandmother, who I knew my grandmother, had 3 boys and 1 girl, the girl being the oldest, all three of her boys went to war. My father, my Uncle Joe, and my Uncle Donald. And the youngest never came home, as we know. So my father and my Uncle Joe, who I knew well also, never spoke about the death. And both of my father and my uncle saw combat. So I wonder, what real effects it had on them as far as, the mental stress and post-traumatic stress, as we call it now, shell shock,
Battle
back
fatigue,
etc. So it wasn't spoken of by the brothers very often. I think it was probably pretty hard to take.
Yeah, even years later, the trauma of that.
And I'm a veteran myself. I'm a VFW commander, so I served 22 years in the military. So I'm pretty familiar with military, what goes on.
Are there any memories that were ever shared with you?
Well, I can remember my older brother when we would go he was born on March 18th, Uncle Donald. So on St. Patrick's Day, my one grandmother's home was in Brooklyn, New York, and Grandma Hughes was in Astoria, Queens. So my older brother would say to me, we're going to go to the happy grandmothers, and now we're going to go to the sad grandmothers, because he was born the day after St. Patrick's Day, and that's why his name was probably Donald Patrick Hughes. And the bunting in the 50s would still be hung on the house in Astoria, Queens, around St. Patrick's Day. There's a story within the story, and what had happened when I was notified of my brother Donald's death, and he was living in Southeast Asia for a long time. So he was in the United States Marine Corps Reserve, and I had a marker, a place for him in the Calverton National Cemetery, VA cemetery. At that time, I realized there was no individual marker that I knew of for my Uncle Donald. So I went on a quest to get a marker, and I had to work with the National Archives, and it was difficult paperwork-wise. I had documentation, but they wanted his date of entry into the military. I had everything else, but I didn't have that. Eventually, at the same time that I got approval for his marker, I was notified by Mr. Heineman by letter that, this was, the Albacore was discovered, and so it was a good feeling. It was, that their site of all these 85 men will be, forever there, and that's where their grave is. So, on an eternal patrol.